This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, a podcast devoted to regular pastors and regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman. I'm the regular pastor here at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Odessa, Texas. Welcome to Season 5 of the Regular Pastor Podcast. In Season 5, I'm talking about books and ideas and how books and the ideas you find in books relate to the day-to-day, grinded out, joyful, but often difficult ministry of regular pastors. The book that I want to talk about today is titled Crisis of Confidence. The subtitle is Reclaiming the Historic Faith in a Culture Consumed with Individualism and Identity. The author of this book is Carl Trueman. The book is published by Crossway in 2024. It's 192 pages in a hardback format. The last 12 are index and endnotes, and so this is about a 180-page book. There is an introductory chapter. There's a conclusion at the end, and then in the middle, the bulk of the book is 6 chapters. There's no parts or sections to this book, just 6 chapters in the middle. Chapter 1, The Cultural Case Against Creeds and Confessions. 2, The Foundations of Creedalism. 3, The Early Church. 4, Classic Protestant Confessions. 5, Confession is Praise. And then Chapter 6 on the usefulness of creeds and confessions. Just a little bit about the author, Carl Trueman. He's a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. Previously, he taught historical theology at Westminster Theological Seminary and at Princeton. He received his M.A. from the University of Cambridge and his Ph.D. from the University of Aberdeen. Trueman is esteemed as a church historian. He is the author of over a dozen books. Most notably, recently, he has released The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then a smaller sort of abbreviated version of that book, Strange New World. He's also the author of Histories and Fallacies, Luther on the Christian Life, and The Creedal Imperative. Formerly, Trueman was the editor for the theological journal Themelios, and he is an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He is a member of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. I think most people regard Trueman as both a churchman and as a legitimate scholar. If you want to know the big idea of this book, you just turn to the introduction, page 1. Trueman very clearly says this: "The burden that motivates my writing of this book is my belief that creeds and confessions are vital to the present and future well-being of the church. Such a statement may well jar evangelical ears that are used to the notion that Scripture alone is to be considered the sole supreme authority for Christian faith and practice." And so he is writing in defense of the usefulness and the essential role that creeds and confessions play in the life of the evangelical church. He is not trying to supplant Scripture as the supreme authority for Christian faith and practice, but he is saying that we do need creeds. Let me share with you a couple of important ideas from this book. One is right towards the beginning, about page 4. Trueman makes the point, and this is really fundamental to understand if you're thinking about church history or local church ministry today. He makes the point that Christians are not divided between those who have creeds and confessions and those who don't. Rather, they're divided between those who have public creeds and confessions that are written down and they're public documents and they're subject to public scrutiny, evaluation, and critique. And on the other hand, those who have private creeds and confessions that are often improvised, unwritten, not open to public scrutiny, not susceptible to evaluation, and crucially, and ironically, not therefore subject to testing by Scripture to see whether they are true. And he's making this point because anti-confessionalism, that's his term, anti-confessionalism is widespread amongst evangelicals who are skeptical about relying on the authority of tradition or extra biblical works to establish what we believe and what we do as Christians. Trueman's point is simple. Nobody uses the Bible alone. Now, the moment that you use a translation of Scripture or a lexicon or a commentary or you read a book, you have now gone outside of Scripture. The moment that you stop reading Scripture verbatim and you make any comment about it in preaching or teaching, you have now gone beyond Scripture. And I think this is something that regular pastors bump into all the time, the idea that we want to have no creed but the Bible, especially in my tribe of Southern Baptists. This is a not uncommon idea, and I've heard it in Kentucky, I've heard it in Oklahoma, I've heard it in Texas. No creed but the Bible. Baptists are not creedal people. And Trueman is saying we're all creedal people. Some of us have written our creeds down, and they can be evaluated, and we can measure how closely they align with Scripture. And some of us have not, and you're just sort of freewheeling, and there is no ability to scrutinize and determine whether or not your doctrinal positions are faithful to Scripture or not. So I think that's a helpful idea. No one really operates without creeds or confessions, as much as some people try to say that they do. Another really, really helpful idea from this book you find about in the middle, page 48 and 49. And Trueman is just talking about the fact that some folks are obsessed with not getting their theology from dead white men. And Trueman just says this: the status of being dead, white, or male is neither here nor there when it comes to issues of theological truth. And I'm inclined to say of cultural value either. Just because these pundits cannot see beyond race, gender, and whether someone has a pulse, does not mean that the rest of us need to cower before their simplistic categories of discourse. All humans are partakers of a common human nature. All are addressed by the same revelation of the same God, and all are called to respond to that revelation. That includes dead white men. He just is making the point that this intersectionality, postmodern, we're not going to listen to dead white men who have had power and ruled over everyone else. We want to get our theology from queer, black, whatever. He's just saying this is ridiculous, and the color of a person's skin and the era in which they live shouldn't really have any bearing on whether or not those individuals give support to certain doctrinal positions or not. And specifically, he's talking about the men, most of them dead white men, who wrote the confessions that are being addressed in this book, specifically like the Westminster Confession and other Reformation statements of faith. So he's just saying, don't worry about this. Don't cower before the people who suggest that you can't get your theology from a dead white guy. One more helpful idea is on page 130. This chapter is talking about how creeds lead to doxology. Creeds lead to worship and praise. And I think there's a helpful statement or a helpful idea here. He says, if the standard level of what is done in a worship service is set at that which the newest, least informed Christian can understand, we are doomed to remain forever in spiritual infancy. As Christians, we should expect worship to always be a learning experience. And in particular, what he's talking about here is reciting something like the Nicene Creed or talking about Trinitarian doctrine in a worship service. And he understands that that will be a lot to take in for people who are brand new to the faith or people who are not yet believers. But he's saying we have to do this if we always water it down to the least common denominator that makes everyone feel comfortable and involved. We'll never grow. We'll never stretch ourselves. We'll never move beyond just the very, very elementary basic building blocks of the faith. If I had to share with you my favorite quote from the book, I actually pulled this from the preface at the beginning. He talks about old creeds versus the new creed. And he just points out something that I think is a helpful category to understand. He says Christianity involves a creed, a code, and a cult. The creed sets out the beliefs of the church, beliefs about God, creation, human beings, sin, redemption, consummation. It describes reality. The code presents the moral vision for life here on earth. God's people are meant to reflect God's character. That was true in Old Testament Israel. It's true, it remains true in the New Testament. Third, the cult is the way in which Christians are to worship the God described in the creed and whose character is reflected in the code. The three are all intimately connected and grounded in the reality of God, and all are non-negotiable. No church and no Christian merely has a creed or a code or a cult. All three are inseparable facets of the one Christian faith. I think that's just a helpful idea to understand. Some churches are going to be more formal and official and forthcoming in what their creed is or what their code is or what their cult is. Others, extreme forms of low church Christianity, are going to be less formal when it comes to a creed or a code or a cult, what they believe, how they live, and how they worship. But every manifestation of Christianity has all of these three components: a creed, a code, and a cult. What's the ministry takeaway of this book? Well, I'm reading Trueman, who's a Presbyterian, as a Baptist, and I'm thankful for his willingness to include the Baptist Confession of 1689, which is a revision of the Westminster Confession. There are minor changes there to baptism and polity, and this is not a major contribution from a unique sense or a creative sense, but it is proof that Baptists do have a confessional heritage, and I am thankful that Trueman included this as an example of confessionalism in Protestant churches or in evangelical churches. The reality is that Baptists do need confessions. We need to understand why they were written. We need the guardrails that they provide in terms of theology. We need the wisdom of the past. We certainly don't need to try to rediscover everything new in each generation. And I think that we need to keep writing creeds and confessions and keep revising them with caution, not in an unhinged way, but in a cautionary way. And this would lead me to the one critique I have of this book, and there may be just some fundamental differences between Trueman being a Presbyterian and me being in a Baptist, specifically a Southern Baptist context. But in the appendix, Trueman talks about whether or not we should revise creeds and supplement the creeds. And his conclusion is that supplementation is often the lazy option. He feels like we have most everything we need after 2,000 years of church history in the creeds that have been written. I would slightly disagree with that, simply from the fact that vocabulary changes, new ideas pop up in the world and in the church, and I think from time to time it is important to write new statements that clarify what we believe and why we believe it. These can be new original statements and confessions, or they could be revisions. I think about the Chicago statement and the Danvers statement and the Nashville statement. I think they all make important contributions to what we believe as Protestant Christians, as evangelical Christians, as Reformed Christians. I think specifically about the Southern Baptist Convention and the issues that we're facing right now with respect to the office or the role or the function of a pastor, elder, overseer. And I just think the SBC is at a place where more clarity would be helpful, rather than simply looking back and arguing over the things that have been written in the past, where there was perhaps more unity underneath the service that we took for granted. So one friendly criticism to the book, and maybe that just comes from my perspective as a Baptist compared to Trueman's perspective as a minister in the OPC. If you look this book up on Goodreads, you will find it has a 4.4 rating out of 5. I gave it a 5-star rating. I think it's a great book, a helpful book. If you're a pastor, I think you ought to read it. I think it will solidify for you why you need more than just the Bible in the formulation of your theology and in the work of preaching the Bible and in the work of guarding the faith once for all delivered to the saints. This is a great book arguing for the importance and the necessity of creeds and confessions in the life of the church. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. You can subscribe for weekly episodes here in Season 5, wherever you're listening. Thank you for leaving us a good rating, A+, 5 stars, whatever would be top-notch rating. Leave that for us on the platform that you're using. You can follow me at regularpastor.com, and you can find me on Goodreads by searching for Landon Coleman. If you have a book recommendation you'd like me to read and review here on the podcast, let me know. Landon at emmanuelodessa.com. Until next week, this is the Regular Pastor, out.